From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Library of Congress. Today's program is presented by the Office of Equal Employment Opportunity and Diversity Programs, formerly known as the Office of Opportunity, Inclusiveness, and Compliance, with the support of the Office of the Chief of Staff, who's represented by the Office, the Chief of Staff himself, Mr. Newland. Thank you for being here. Today's guest speaker is the founder and Chief Learning Officer of Cook Ross Incorporated, a consulting firm whose mission is to provide powerful solutions to organizations around the world in the areas of diversity, inclusion, cultural competence, leadership development, and organizational change management. He's one of the nation's leading diversity consultants and a nationally recognized expert on diversity, leadership, and organizational change. He is the author of the book Everyday Bias: Identifying and Navigating Unconscious Judgments in Our Daily Lives. His book in the hardcover will be available for sale after today's presentation for a cost of $30 and will be available at the table by the entrance. His other works include Reinventing Diversity, Transforming Organizational Community to Strengthen People, Purpose, and Performance. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of Maryland and pursued postgraduate studies in administration, management, and organizational development at Wheelock College in Boston. He can be heard on NPR on the first Monday of every month at noon as a regular guest of the Kojo Monday Show. Please join me in welcoming our guest, Howard J. Ross.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm going to actually start with a little video clip.
He's the boss. She's bossy. The negative way women are perceived at the office in a new ad for Pantene that's gone viral. It's hit a nerve, so we set out to find the truth. Are women who act exactly the same as men seen differently? Listen to this woman. How do you feel about her as a job candidate?
I know the Windows operating systems like the back of my hand, no problem.
Now, listen to him.
I know the Windows operating systems like the back of my hand, no problem.
The candidates in these videos are actors in a Yale University hiring experiment. The resumes, identical. The interviews, identical.
I'm extremely good
at sizing up people quickly and then delegating responsibility accordingly.
The only difference is gender. But when it comes to who got the job,
I thought the male applicant had better soft skills.
I'd say the woman was arrogant and overselling.
In hundreds of evaluations, the female job seekers come off as more aggressive, are rated less likable, and they're less likely to be hired.
Isn't it a catch-22? You're supposed to be strong to get that job, and you're saying if you're too strong, you won't get it. You need to behave in this dominant way to advance as a woman in the workplace, but you're seen negatively because that's not how we expect women to behave.
And if you think this is just male bias, it's not. Both men and women doing the hiring made the same call.
I think there's a level of arrogance that might be okay to be a manager, but then there's a step above, and I thought she was slightly above that.
So let's talk.
And when we revealed our study results,
I was surprised by my reaction.
What does that say about us?
We have a long way to go.
Yeah, we do have a long way to go, don't we? We don't have to go far from the morning's news each day to see that we still have a long way to go. And you know, we look at circumstances like this, and of course the first question that comes to mind is a question of equity and justice. You know, how can people be successful if they're not treated fairly simply because of gender or race or any other distinction? But there's another, another important question too, which is how are we going to possibly make decent talent management choices if we're making them based on things we don't even know are manipulating our minds? And so I want to start this afternoon by saying, you know, I don't care what your politics are. You know, I don't care whether you're a Democrat or Republican. I don't care whether you see yourselves as liberal or conservative. I mean, that's something we might talk about over lunch, although these days people are afraid to talk about those things over lunch. What I want to talk about is how does this dynamic, this unconscious way we make decisions about people, impact the essence of who we are as human beings, at our jobs, at work, on the streets? How does it impact people's lives, their livelihoods? And it's not, we know, because most people wake up in the morning and say, how can I suppress the people of color in my organization today? How can I hold down the women? You know, I'm not saying there aren't some people like that. Of course, we know there's some, but overwhelmingly, the issue that we deal with, especially in organizations like yours, especially in organizations where we have a relatively highly educated workforce and, you know, people who are committed to be part of a larger organization, it rarely shows up that way. Something else is going on, and it's something that, if we tell the truth, each of us has experienced. I remember I was down about 2 years ago. I was down at the Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi, doing some work for a couple days with the deans and faculty members down there. And I had to fly from there to New York City for another client, so I had to go through Memphis, Tennessee. And I get to Memphis in time for my last flight out. And as soon as I get to the gate attendant comes on and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, there'll be a 45-minute delay." And the words were barely out of her mouth when this voice booms out from behind me. "You talking to us, lady?" And I turn around and there's a guy sitting behind me who I would best describe as Santa Claus with an attitude. Older white guy, big white beard, white hair, wearing overalls and a flannel shirt with a car magazine in his hand. Yeah, you're chuckling like I did, you know. Kind of got him pegged, right? So I went about my business on my computer until it was time to get on the plane. Comes time to get on the plane, I get down to my seat, and lo and behold, who's sitting next to me but angry Santa Claus? So we did the nod. Travelers know what I mean. You know, then you kind of sit down. We take off, go into parallel play mode. I'm working on my computer. He's reading his magazine. We fly for a couple hours until it's time to do the initial descent to New York City. So I close my computer. And travelers know this is when airplane chat starts, because it's now safe to talk to the person next to you. You're not going to get stuck in a 2-hour conversation with a lunatic, you know. And so I turn to him and I say, "So what takes you to New York?" And he says, "I've got a business meeting." I said, "Really, what are you doing?" And he says, "I'm a radiologist." So boom, there goes that picture, you know. So then I was sort of nonplussed and a little embarrassed, and I said, "So what kind of radiology?" And he says, "Well, you might be interested in this," because I was working on a deck that I was going to be using, and he had clearly been, you know, kind of catching glimpses. He said, "We're studying the brain, and we're watching it on functional magnetic resonating imagery, and we can actually determine which parts of the brains respond when people interact with different kinds of people." Yeah, exactly. So he's studying the very thing I'm the most interested in. And had I not pegged him as Angry Santa the car mechanic and talked to him a little bit earlier, I probably would have saved myself months of research on my book. So I say that because I'm not here to talk about you. This is who we are as human beings, every single one of us. Now, we each have different aspects that we respond to, different kinds of people we respond to. But this is fundamental to who we are as human beings. And it's important for us to recognize that, because if we look at the background through which we've seen diversity and inclusion work over a period of time, it really comes from a very different angle. I've been paid for doing this work now for over 30 years. I go back to the time, some of you remember, when the kind of diversity workshops we did were with a 2x4. You know, you kind of beat people over the head, especially if they looked like this, until at some point they saw the error of their ways. It was always very cathartic if they cried. And then people would sort of, you know, see the light and you would leave. But what I began to notice was when we talked to those people a month later or 2 months later, more times than not, they would say, "Well, that was fine, just don't make me ever do it again." It was a recipe for getting people to watch out what not to do, to be careful what not to say, but it wasn't a recipe for inclusion. It wasn't a recipe for truly engaging, getting people to truly engage. In fact, sometimes it had the opposite effect. It had people be even more tentative. You talk about race, I'm heading out of here because I don't want to say the wrong thing and get in trouble again. So if we look at that, we can kind of see that there's a paradigm that we've dealt with these issues of diversity with for a long, long time. And it's this one, the sort of us versus them paradigm. And as soon as an issue comes up, we immediately put ourselves into a particular position that we've already established. So if you think about something like, I know many of you, how many people remember the incident that happened with Skip Gates, with the Harvard history professor? You remember the beer summit? Right. So Professor Gates, one of America's most notable historians, African American, comes home from a trip to Asia, comes to his front door in Cambridge, Massachusetts, locked out, so he breaks a window so he can get in. Police officers show up. Something happens, and he's arrested. It becomes big news. The next morning, there's his picture, his mugshot on the morning news. How many of us, when we heard that story, already knew what happened? You know what I mean? Either we knew that it was one more time when it was a white police officer treating an African American a particular way, or we knew, if we're on the other side of the equation, one more time when a public servant just doing his job is called a racist for no reason. Whatever it is, we choose sides. And this is the nature of this us versus them dynamic. If you have any question about this, by the way, read the news this morning about the president's speech last night. Or better yet, watch MSNBC and Fox News, and you will wonder if you were watching the same speech. Because most of the responses, and we have to acknowledge on all sides, most of the responses we were already ready for. Those of us who like the president were ready to agree with what he said. Those of us who don't like the president were ready to have all the excuses, because we no longer look at issues and think about the issues and come to determinations. We come from our ideology to those issues looking for how we can be right. And if we're going to move forward with this issue, we need to be able to look at the whole dynamic that's here, because what gets produced is what I call a conversational network of contention. So this tension that we have around talking about these issues that makes it so painful and frankly, for a lot of people, so frightening to talk about the issues. And that's the background through which we've historically done diversity and inclusion work. So, and we look at it over a period of time. We go back 30, 40 years when this movement really took on in organizations. Mostly, we were looking at coming from a place of ignorance. Starting, people didn't know there were issues, so we had to move from that into compliance and affirmative action. So we have to stop things that are happening badly, fix some things that happen badly, get more people engaged who've been left out, so higher representation, make sure people don't discriminate, so we have laws to protect people so that they're not discriminated against, and ultimately then get to this place of what people call tolerance. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never aspired just to be tolerated. So I've never particularly liked that word. But the metaphor I use for it is it's sort of like in the old days before the wellness movement hit back in the 1980s. You would go to a doctor, and the job of the doctor was to get you unsick. Very rarely in the 1960s, 1970s, if you went to a doctor, did they say, tell me about your exercise program, tell me about what you're eating, they just didn't do that. That wasn't their job. You came in with an illness, they made you unsick. And then at some point we realized there's a whole nother side to the whole wellness continuum, and that is, how can you actually live a life that has you be well, like to exercise and to eat well and to manage your stress and all the things that we now know are so important to us and doctors now talk to us about. Well, similarly, we found out that this part of the equation only gets us representation, but what it doesn't do is help us really engage with each other. How do we manage that diversity so we know how it's affecting us? And ultimately, how do we have full inclusion and cultural competency? And as a result of that, we can see that despite all of our efforts, despite the millions of dollars that have been spent and the hundreds of thousands or millions of people who've gone through training programs or the laws that have been passed, we still have any number of examples that we see on a daily basis where people are treated differentially, based on race, based on sexual orientation, based on gender, based on any number of different things. Now we know this has been a subject of enormous research, how it is that the mind does this. I want to share just a handful of the literally 1,200 studies that have been done in the last 10 years alone on unconscious bias. So this one is a pretty interesting one. Erin Reeves is a researcher in Chicago. She went to groups of law firms and she gave partners a memo that was written by a man named Thomas Meyer, they were told. It had 22 intentional errors that were written into the memo. Half of the lawyers were told that Thomas Meyer was white, and half of them were told that he was black. When they were told that he was white, they found on average, they rated it on average 4.1 out of 5. They found on average 10.2 of the errors, and you can see some of the things they said. He has potential, has good analytical skills, generally a good writer, but needs to work on some things. When they were told that Thomas Meyer was black, they found 40% more errors, rated him a 3.2 instead of a 4.1. And this Thomas Meyer needs a lot of work, average at best, and I can't believe he went to NYU. Nothing different about the resumes except the race that they were told at the name of the person who wrote them. In this one at Columbia University and NYU and Wharton, they tracked emails and found that women had 35% more emails ignored and almost 60% more meetings declined. Now this one for me is particularly interesting because when we send emails out into the world and they don't get responded to, none of us know whether it's because a person is a terrible communicator or whether they're just not listening to us. We all know privately we have a little pecking order of emails, don't we? We have the emails we'll get to when we get to them, and then we have the emails that we got to take a break to see what somebody's sending us. The people who are important to us. So when you look at these are things that we would never know, and yet obviously has a huge impact on people staying in the loop, people getting engaged with things, people being able to have their work valued and input, all these kinds of things. Accent is another one. Researchers at the University of Chicago and Tel Aviv University found that we believe people more when they have accents similar to ours and less when they have accents different than ours, with one exception. Anybody want to guess? That's right, the British, that's right. We think people with British accents not only make better movie villains, but they're also smarter. One of our clients in New York City there's a guy who works there from Liverpool, where the Beatles come from, and Liverpool is a very blue-collar town, so they speak a form of Cockney there. It's called Scosh, I think, and I think that's the way it's pronounced. And it's sort of what he said, he was told growing up it was gutter English. So he says, whenever I fly back to visit my family in Liverpool and then come back to the States, I feel myself getting smarter every mile I fly. Weight is another one. Researchers at least 4 different universities have found that doctors discriminate against patients who are overweight, spend less time with them, less follow-up on protocols, in every way, less patient service. They also found, other researchers found at Johns Hopkins University, that patients do the same thing with doctors, that if a doctor is overweight, they tend to listen to the doctor's instructions less and evaluate their treatment less. And then this is one I did. I've got an artificial knee, and so every time I go through scanning, like downstairs, I have to do the wand thing. So what I began to notice was I was in airports that it seemed like I was going through slower when I was in casual clothing than when I was dressed in a business suit. So it turns out, I did my own study over a period of a year, and it turns out about 47% faster when I'm wearing different clothing. Now, most of us know that this is true, that appearance changes the way we're related to, whether it's because of clothing or piercings or tattoos or hairstyles or age, any number of things. And this is my new favorite one. This came out of the National Academy of Sciences just last year. They studied the 47 most damaging hurricanes over the last 60 years, and they found to see if there was any pattern in the fatalities associated with gender name of hurricanes. And they found that it turns out that hurricanes named after women kill roughly twice as many people as hurricanes named after men. Now, lest you think this has something to do with hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, it's got nothing to do with that. What the researchers found at the National Academy of Sciences, this is not some touchy-feely organization, the reason is, believe it or not, is because people take hurricanes named after men more seriously and therefore prepare for them more. Now, how insane is that? Can you, that's right, absolutely. Can you imagine the conversation? So Leslie comes up to me and she says, I just choose Leslie because we're old friends. And I said, so she comes up to me and she says, hey, Howard, there's a hurricane coming. I said, really, what's his name? She says, Hurricane Mary. I say, oh, don't worry, it's a girl. This is how crazy we are. And I could go and I could give you a list of studies about virtually every aspect of human identity. And we have a study that shows that people are biased based on that. Now, we're laughing at this one, but obviously the same dynamic occurs when a police officer walks up to a young man in the street and has a reaction that this young man is more dangerous than another young man. I better pull my gun out for this young man. I better be on high alert for this young man. And this young man ends up shot or dead. It shows up seriously when somebody comes in for an interview and I listen to them just differently than somebody else, as we saw in that video. They say the same things, they have the same kind of resume, they appear all the same, and yet for some reason this person resonates with me more. I feel more comfortable with them. I choose them. So all of this is happening all the time around us, and what our studies show is that very little of it happens out of intention. I mean, there are people out there who are hateful and hurtful, there's no question about it, but as my good friend Brett Pelham, who was a researcher at the National Science Foundation, said, at some level, all bias is unconscious bias. Even the biases that we consciously have now have been unconsciously fed by the various things that we've learned throughout our lives. We weren't conscious about it when we were 3 years old, and being a boy, if I picked up my sister's doll, and my mom slapped me on the hand and said, oh, only sissies play with dolls. And all of a sudden that shows up as homophobia 15 years later. So we want to look at this, and what I want to do is look at, with you a little bit, go behind the curtain of this. Why does this happen? How does it happen? And then ultimately I want to leave you with some thoughts about the things that we're discovering we can do about this, because we do have something to say about our biases. We can't eliminate bias, but we can learn to navigate them better. We can learn to mitigate the impact on our lives. And then I will save some time, by the way, at the end for questions. So if you have questions, you want to, kind of make a note of them or jot them down, I will save about 15 minutes, hopefully, at the end, so we can engage a little bit. And I'm actually willing for any of you who'd like to stay a little bit later than 1 o'clock. I'd be glad to stick around for a little bit longer. So let's start with this question. How much do we really know?
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
Sorry, madam.
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
Action.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
How many of us have seen this happen? This, by the way, was one of a series of videos that they did in London to make people more aware of bicycle riders, to make drivers more aware of bicycle riders. How many of you have been in a meeting, something happens, some interaction between people, and you walk out and you're saying to yourself, I can't believe that, and somebody else says, what are you talking about? Anybody have that happen? Yeah. Now, it particularly happens to, a particular group of people. We notice that people are listened to differently depending upon the group they're in. Sometimes that's by status, organizational status. We listen to management maybe more than non-management. We listen to people from our department differently than we listen to people from other departments. Sometimes it's because of an identity factor, race, gender, something like that. We tend to value people more without realizing it, very much like we saw, again, in that video. And yet when we look at these pictures, we can see all of these things are happening. All of these changes right in front of our eyes, and you knew to be looking for something. It wasn't like something just popped up on the screen. You know what we're here to talk about, and I said, do we really see the world like we think we do? And yet still we don't see it. Wow. This is occurring all the time. This is a phenomenon that psychologists call selective attention. And there's been a tremendous amount of research around this. For example, there's a researcher named Trafton Drew at Harvard Medical School who sent out a picture of a lung scan. It was actually a lung scan that he sent out to radiologists. He asked the radiologist to look for cancer nodes, which are very, very tiny, obviously. Embedded in the lung scan is a picture of a gorilla, 50 times the size of a cancer node. 50 times the size. 83% of the radiologists didn't see it. They were looking so carefully for this that they couldn't see this. Any of you have children and ask them to go to the closet to look for something? You know what I'm talking about, right? That's selective attention at its best. Now, this doesn't only impact how we see, it also impacts how we hear. So I'm going to do another little experiment. Folks on this side of the room, in just a moment, I want you to close your eyes. I'm not going to let them take your stuff, don't worry. And folks over here, I want you to watch the screen. I'm going to show you all a 5-second video, and I'm going to ask you what you hear. Okay? So close your eyes over here. Here we go.
Ba, 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 ba.
Good. So open your eyes. So if you heard ba ba, please raise your hands. If you heard something like da da or ga ga, raise your hands. Or it's L sound, anything other than ba ba, raise your hands. Now, how does that happen? Very odd, right? I'm going to play it again. This time you can open and close your eyes at intervals. You'll actually hear it change right before your eyes.
Ba, 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 ba.
Now, aside from being way cool, what does this teach us? We actually hear with our eyes more than we realize. In this case, it happens because the video is of him saying gaga, but the voiceover is of him saying baba. You actually hear what he said with your eyes closed. Over here, the brain plays a little trick on us. It has to deal with the dissonance between what we're seeing and what we're hearing, so it usually morphs into a D sound. For some people, a little bit of an L or a little bit of a G. But the point is, it's a different sound, even though the sound that's playing is the same. Now, this can happen in lots of different ways. For example, many of us have seen it happen this way.
We have got to cut cost people ideas.
We could open an account on FedEx.com.
We have got to cut cost people ideas.
We could open an account on FedEx.com, save 10% on online express shipping.
Okay, how about this? We open an account on FedEx.com, we save 10% on online express shipping.
That is wonderful. You just said the same thing I said, only you did this.
No, I did this.
Makes all the difference.
Bingo.
That's good.
Right on the nose. It's a great idea.
Something nobody notices, and 10 minutes later, it's a eureka moment when the man says it, you know. As my friend Sukhvinder Singh Obi, a brain scientist in Canada, says, our brains seem to have evolved to be good enough most of the time. So we want to look at this a little bit because this is really at the core of what bias is. You know, how many of you, when you hear the word bias, tend to think of it in negative terms? You hear it? Yeah. In fact, bias is neither inherently positive or negative. It is simply a function of the mind that's designed to help us quickly chart how to deal with the circumstance. And why would we have that function, do you think?
It's evolutionary.
Yeah, for survival, exactly right. 20,000 years ago, we see a group of people by the water hole. We had to determine instantly whether it was them or us. If we made the wrong decision, we got killed. So as a result of that, we have a tendency to spot these things very quickly. Now, we know from research that we first spot race because it's the most visible identifier. Things like gender, we may be more hardwired to see gender because, of course, at times, thousands of years ago, we lived mostly with people who are of the same race, very rarely encountered people of opposite races. But nonetheless, we spot race first. And sometimes this can be very helpful to us to spot a bias, and sometimes it can't. If I walk up to one of you with a knife in my hand like this, you don't look up and say, I wonder what that is and what he's going to do with it. You quickly get into defensive mode and it saves your life. We have a bias against that. But obviously, when it involves somebody on the street and a gun, it can have horrible consequences. When it involves somebody in a job interview, it can have terrible professional consequences. So the phenomenon can be either positive or negative. It can help or hurt us. But when we're not aware of it, it has dangerous consequences. And by the way, what do you call biases when you agree to them and even write them all down? That's all qualifications are. Now, I'm not saying qualifications are a bad thing. They're valuable. Makes it easier than having to interview all of the tens of thousands of people who probably apply for jobs here, for example. You couldn't possibly interview all of them. So we create qualifications. So we say, for example, college degree. So toss out Steve Jobs, toss out Bill Gates, toss out Mark Zuckerberg. No. We have to be careful because when we create these qualifications without realizing it, we're also limiting ourselves to see the people who follow the most traditional path. And there are lots of different examples of how that shows up. But I want to talk for just a moment about what we're discovering about why the brain functions in this way. So if you imagine we see something in front of us, some person or circumstance, and immediately what happens is, and we know this now because we can wire the brain of functional magnetic resonating imagery and we can see which parts of the brain function, then we immediately go to what Daniel Kahneman, great psychologist, Nobel Prize winner, calls our fast brain. This is the limbic system. If I use my hand as a brain model, imagine this is the profile. The limbic system is in where my thumb, actually it'd be better if I had two thumbs, but that would be a little weird. That if I had, that's where the limbic system is. The amygdala, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, these are the parts of the brain that quickly spot what's going on, try to figure out very quickly what it is. It's like going to a file cabinet and decide what's the action to it. And so if I take this and is it Bob, is that right? Yeah, if I throw this at Bob, he's not going to say, what happens when it gets here? His hand will shoot up instinctively. It's a protection mechanism. And it can save our lives. So you're driving in the morning and a car stops short in front of you, you see those taillights going, you don't say to yourself, what's the best thing to do now, or you'd be in their back seat. Your foot hits the brake before you get a chance to think about it. This is where the heart of a lot of our core stereotypes come from. Quick assessment of that person. Quick association, put myself into friend or foe mode. And we're particularly sensitive to foe. We look first to eliminate foe before we see friend. So we can see this again in the brain. It takes about 20% more brain energy fluid, etc., to see something friendly than it does to see something negative. Because the brain wants to make sure it's safe before it will allow things in. And this is why, of course, the instinctive reactions that happen with people in tense situations are really challenging. Because what happens is the amygdala, the basic fear center of the brain, gets charged and you have an amygdala hijacking. It takes over. Right now, we have a collective amygdala hijacking happening in our culture around Islamophobia. People are reacting in ways that are completely contrary to anything that they would have rationally thought or believed. Doing things that are completely inappropriate. I'm not talking now about political ideologies and thoughtful processes about what's the best way to handle things. I'm talking about that fear reaction. When somebody comes into an airport, gets on an airplane, and a woman with a hijab walks in, and somebody's looking where she sits. That's the fear reaction. Most of us have felt those at times, and we're even embarrassed by them when we feel them, but we can't help it. Just like I was embarrassed by my reaction to Angry Santa Claus. It wasn't like a reaction I chose. I actually said to myself afterwards, you've been doing this work for 30 years? Actually, I went to my first civil rights meeting 50 years ago. How long do you take before you get it out of your system? Well, the truth is we don't get it out of our system. We do, however, have the capacity for more thoughtful thinking. It lives in our slow brain, in the prefrontal cortex, this part of the brain, the red part in this picture you see, the most remarkable part of the human brain, 4 to 5 times larger than any other animal per body size, 2 to 3 times more active, gives us the capability of what we call metacognition, the ability to watch ourselves think. This is where we have thoughts like, what made me think about that? Any of you who've done any kind of personal development work, any kind of therapy work, it's all about developing the prefrontal ability to watch ourselves. This is where we see, oh yeah, I know my mother triggers me. Let me go take a breath so that I don't react. I know I'm about to wring my kid's neck because once again their homework is a mess. I take a breath and I settle myself down. This is the part of the brain that allows us to socialize ourselves so that we're not just reaction machines, robots dealing with each other. And it's going on all the time. All the time. Now, how that shows up is over the course of our lives, we develop sort of an internal book of rules. So I'm going to step back from behind you for just a minute. So if I walk up, for example, how did you know to do that?
Social cues.
Exactly. This is a social cue we had. I'm sorry, what's your name?
Travis.
Travis. So now how did a handshake feel, Travis?
Yours?
Yeah.
Light.
Yeah. Light, he says. So I shook Travis's hand much softer than we normally do in American business environment, which is more like a wrestling match, you know. Your description was actually pretty tame. Most people will say weak, fishy, you know, all these kind of. But how many of us have heard somebody say at one point or another, if somebody shakes my hand like that at the beginning of an interview, forget it, the interview's over. Now think about how insane that is. In about a third of the world, that's the normal way to shake hands. I could have a disability. I could be recovering from an injury or have an injury. And yet, what are we looking for? We're looking for these shortcuts. And so we learn this book of rules throughout our lives. We learn certain ways that we're supposed to be, and this creates a schema. It creates a frame of our brain frames what we see and draws out that which we are interested in. So watch a shoe shine person in the airport the next time you're in the airport or the train station, and as you're watching people walk down the hallway, watch what they're looking at. What do you think they're looking at? Shoes, exactly. They're looking for the person with dirty shoes so they can say, you need a shine. If you ask them what they see, you see 3 men, 2 women, and a child. They see 3 loafers, 2 floor shimes, and a pair of sneakers. And they often wouldn't even be able to tell you anything about the person because they've never looked above the knee. This is the way schema works. Let me show you. Take a look at this picture and see if you can identify anything recognizable in this picture. Anybody see anything? Yeah, what do you see? A dog, okay. Anybody else? Cow. Okay, somebody saw the cow. Well, let me make it, there is a cow in the picture. I'll make it easier for you. We'll superimpose it. Okay, so can everybody see the cow now? Yeah, yeah. Okay, so anybody who doesn't see the cow? Okay, let me quickly point it out here. 2 years. Okay, great. So you see, now I'm going to remove the superimposed picture, go back to the original, and tell me now if you can avoid seeing the cow. Right? The thing that was invisible just a moment ago, now you can't not see. If I came in next week, immediately you would see the cow because your schema has changed. Now, if schema can be impacted by something like shiny shoes or a silly game like this, how can it not be impacted by these bodies, these identities we live our whole lives in? Now, as men, we see a different world than women. As people of color, a different world than white people. Because our schema impacts that which we see and that which we don't. And so we're sensitive to certain things. We're alert about certain things. We're looking for certain things or completely oblivious to certain things. Which is why it's so frustrating sometimes to have these conversations. Why are you making such a big deal out of that, somebody will say. Because it happens to me every day. You're just not seeing it. Particularly the micro behaviors. We sometimes call them micro inequities, micro advantages. Some people are using the term microaggressions these days. The little things that have an impact but don't seem very big in and of themselves. Somebody walks up to you and you give them your full attention versus another person walks up to you and you tell them to go ahead while you're multitasking on your phone. By the way, how many people here pride yourselves as being multitaskers? Anybody else besides me? You know there's bad news, right? We can't. The brain doesn't multitask. I mean, it can if you're doing some kind of a mindless activity, like a repetitive task, like if you knit and you've been knitting for years, your hands knit by themselves or something like that. But mostly what we call multitasking is serial tasking. We're looking at this, this, this. We're kind of going like this, which is why when we leave those meetings these days where everybody's sitting at the meeting like this, looking at their phones as if nobody knows what they're doing. And then you walk out of the room, what's the first thing they usually say? What did they say about that? Because we only see about 70%. So schema gives us a particular background, and the background frames what we see and becomes self-fulfilling. We gather information to support our already point of view. This is what we were seeing this morning with the pundits looking at the speech. I already believe that the president is good, or I already believe the president is bad. Therefore, I'll cherry pick the speech and take out the points that prove my point and ignore the things that may be iffy, and I'll make that case. Or even sometimes take the same piece of data and use it for two completely different purposes. And we do this with people, of course. You have somebody who you like who works with you and they screw some things up and their excuses make a lot of sense. Somebody you don't like so much, it's just one more excuse. And this is affected, and I say that definitively because, as I said, we have over 1,000 studies in 10 years alone. It is affected by people's identity. It's affected by who that person is and what that person is. So that background becomes self-reinforcing. Now, just to give you a sense of the comparison, if the slow brain capacity is roughly the size of a gallon milk jug, the fast brain is like the Milky Way. Literally hundreds of thousands of times more fast brain reactions than slow brain reactions. We're robots basically walking around pretending like we're sentient beings. Now, ironically, it's only when we accept that about ourselves that we actually have the opportunity for consciousness. When we realize how automatic we are and we begin watching it, then we have an opportunity to disengage it at times. Otherwise, we go around making stuff up about people. So I want you to imagine for a minute, you've got a son or a daughter, and they call you and they say, Mom, Dad, I'm in love. I found the guy of my dreams. He's the one, and I can't wait to bring him home at Thanksgiving and introduce him to you. Well, you're kind of anxious, right? You want to see this guy. So you go on their Facebook page or whatever social media you tend to prefer, and you see pictures of them with two men, this one or this one. Who are you hoping for? Right? Well, as it turns out, this guy is John Fetterman. He's the mayor of Braddock, Pennsylvania, candidate for Senate in the state of Pennsylvania right now. The master's degree in public policy from Harvard, served in AmeriCorps, and got international media attention for the amazing way he transformed the old steel town that Braddock is and turned it into a thriving community. He actually works with other communities to help them do the same thing. Amazing guy. You're just look him up. This is Ted Bundy, the serial killer. And yet we do this with people all the time. We spot people all the time. We make stuff up about them. If you look around the room for a minute, just let your eyes, don't let it settle on any, but just look around the room for a second and see what you make up about. Who's the smart one? Who's the one who's not so smart? Who's the one who's in a leadership position or not? Who's the one who looks friendly or not so friendly? Who's the one who looks scared or not so scared? This is what we do with people. We make these assessments and then we act in accordance with those assessments. And it's not only individual, by the way, it shows up as social groups too. In fact, we're much more influenced, what we're learning is we're much more influenced by the groups that we belong to than we ever even thought possible. You know, most of us have heard of Maslow's hierarchy. Abraham Maslow created this model in 1943, core foundational model of modern psychology. Maslow said that there are certain things that needs that are more important than other needs. And you got to get our physiological needs met and safety, and then we worry about belongingness on up the chain. Turns out that we're discovering Maslow was wrong, that belongingness is actually the key human need. And it makes sense if we think about it, because what's the most vulnerable time of a human being's existence? Infancy, right? The first 2 years of our lives, we can't exist unless we belong to somebody. We literally will die. Our first imprint is, I exist because he or she exists, whoever our primary caretaker is. And in fact, we know that being excluded from a group triggers activity in the same regions of the brain associated with physical pain, which is why every time one of these terrible incidents happen, Sandy Hook, Columbine, Charleston, what's the first word you almost always hear used to describe the individual? Loner. Almost every time, right? And it also contributes to the fact that 4 times as many gay teenagers commit suicide, because that same sense of loneliness gets internalized, even sometimes separating somebody from their own family. But the behavior also leads, this phenomenon also leads to behavior that sometimes is just downright funny.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with a white shirt, the lady with a trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff, will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little,
he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again. Here's the candid subject. Here comes the candid camera staff, 3 of them at least. And this man has apparently been in groups before.
We don't do the same thing, right? I mean, how many times have you gone out in the evening, I'm not going to have anything to drink tonight until everybody else orders a glass of wine, and what the heck, I'll have it. You know? Or more importantly, you come into a calibration meeting, you're evaluating an employee, and there are 5 of you in the meeting. And you come in really high on the employee, you're very positive about them, but before you get to weigh in, the other 4 people trash them. Now, all the terrible things about this employee, why they're no good. And then they say, what do you think? And all of a sudden you notice you're a little bit more hesitant with your praise, a little bit more muted, if you even give it at all. There's part of us that wants to go along with the crowd. And this is one of the reasons why workplace environments, doing this work in workplace environments, can be so valuable when it's done well. Because you begin to create a culture in which people are supported in making more conscious choices and thinking more carefully about the decisions they make around people. But there is good news. I promised you I would leave you with some of the things we could do about this, because, you know, at this point, a lot of times people are saying, great, now you convinced me that I can't believe anything I think, and I'm got biases about people that I'm not even aware of. Thank you very much for that, right? But there is good news, and that is that there are ways that we can consciously develop the ability to be more mindful of our decision making, to be more thoughtful about the things that influence us. We've identified 6 things in particular because the unconscious mind is quite malleable. We've got a remarkable capacity for what we call neuroplasticity, to rewire our brains. I mean, the notion that you can't teach an old dog new tricks isn't even true for dogs. We're always learning new things. I remember when my stepfather, who passed away about 1.5 years ago now, was 83 when he learned to use the internet. And it was life-altering for him, because now he could shop for himself, even though, you know, he couldn't drive himself anymore. He could send notes to people and receive them, even taught him to Skype so that he could, you know, we could talk to him face to face. It was life-altering, and 83 years old he learned to do it. And he wasn't a technical guy. It's just that, you know, we learn new things all the time. So 6 ways. The first is by far the most important, and that is to recognize and accept that we have bias, that it's foundational to how we see the world. The question is not do we have bias, the question is which are ours. And every single person in this room, if we tell the truth, knows this. We know that there's certain people who we're inclined to like more than others. We know that we go into that party where there's nobody there who we know, and we make a quick mental decision as to who's the person we're going to go up to talk to based on who looks safer or more welcoming. Based on what? Who has looked safer or more welcoming like that before? We project onto that circumstance what we've learned in the past from our book of rules. The metaphor I like to use for this is it's kind of like the clutch in a standard transmission automobile. For those of you who even remember standard transmission automobiles, when you step on the clutch, the motor doesn't stop running. The motor is still running, it's just disengaged from running the car. Similarly, if I say to myself, okay, I have a bias about this, I better be careful about this, when I'm then talking or interacting with that person, I have a chance to separate. I can give an example for myself. I had a young man come in to do an interview a few years ago for an administrative position in our company, and I've been a professional musician for probably 30 years. I don't do it so much anymore, but for about 30 years I played in bands. And so I look at his resume and it says Berklee School of Music for 2 years. And immediately my whole body leaned in. What do you play? What kind of music do you play? And then, you know, because I happened to at this time, like I said, I missed it with the guy in the airplane, but this time I happened to catch it. I said to myself, wait a second, you're not interviewing a bass player. You're interviewing an administrative person. So I actually said to him, you know what, let's hold off on that conversation for now. Maybe we'll talk about that after the interview. Come back to do the interview. Now, I'm not saying it would have been perfect necessarily, that it still might not have influenced me, but I had a far greater chance than what would have normally happened if I was unconscious, which is I would have spent 45 minutes talking with him about music, and then I would have said, now let me ask you these questions so that I can hire you. Because I already heard his bass playing behind my guitar. The second, in order to do that, we have to develop a capacity to observe ourselves. The metaphor that I like to use is to put a flashlight on ourselves, to watch ourselves in action. Mostly the way we relate to the world is we look at what's going on out there, and we figure out why the thing out there is causing us trouble. We have very little attention on how are we responding to what's up there. What is that triggering in us? Who is that person reminding us of? Are there certain circumstances where we notice that we get charged more than others? Now, that's where we begin to see ourselves in action, and that's where we begin to shift ourselves in action. Now, my wife one morning says to me, would you mind taking out the trash? No, I have no problem taking out the trash. I even do it myself sometimes, you know. But for some reason, I just got irritated, and I didn't even know why, you know, at the moment. And then I stopped for a second. I looked. I said, why am I irritated? Then I realized at that moment I saw I was 7 years old and she was my mother. My mother and I used to have righteous battles over the trash. Some of you remember those kinds of things or have them with your own children. Right? And at that moment, something about the way she said it or something about that circumstance reminded me of my mother giving me stuff about not taking out the trash. And so I laughed. I said, sure, Mom, I'll take it out. And given that we both do this work together, she knew exactly what I meant and laughed, and that was the end of it. There's something liberating about this. In order to do this, the third thing is we have to practice what I call constructive uncertainty. Turn some of our exclamation points into question marks. Is that person really that way, or might I be seeing them that way? That's a huge distinction. And one of the ways we do this is by slowing ourselves down. The breath is really valuable. I've been working with police officers around this, and one of the things I'm teaching them is to use the breath when they're on the way to emergent crime scenes. If you just simply do some deep breathing, it slows down the process a little bit. Doesn't put them, so I'm not talking about sitting in cross position saying Om or anything like that. I'm just talking about the reason it happens, by the way, there's a physiological reason for this, that the part of your brain that you need to use in order to consciously slow down your breathing, to deepen your breathing, when you say, okay, take deeper breath, is your prefrontal cortex. You go out of your limbic system when you do that, and your prefrontal area now is what's in charge. The prefrontal area is the slower part of your brain. They may get to the emergent crime scene and for a split second longer wait before they pull that trigger. For a split second longer, consider what they're doing. Because, you know, I want to make it really clear, I have tremendous compassion for what police officers have to deal with as well. You put yourself into a situation where in moments you have to make a decision that could cost somebody else their life, it could cost you your career, you could be the next public pariah, and yet if you wait too long, you could be killed. I mean, I don't know anybody here, but I'm not signing up for that job. But at the same time, we know the consequences of it not going well. We're trying to teach people to be a little bit more conscious about that. Rollo May, the great psychologist, said freedom is the capacity to pause between stimulus and response. Another one that we found that really makes a difference is to engage with others and expose yourself to counter stereotypes. In other words, positive examples of people who we normally have negative stereotypes around. So pictures on the wall make a difference. Things like Black History Month still matter because they give us positive stereotypes. Now, it would be a lot better if the other 11 months weren't White History Month. And if we didn't, if we didn't continually reinforce that, if we really embedded it more. But nonetheless, these kinds of things really matter because they give us those counter stereotypes. Spending time with people makes a difference. Meeting people from other cultures, identities, races, racial groups, sexual orientation makes a difference. In a sad way, one of the things we're finding that's in the research that's behind the acceleration of rights for LGBT people today, ironically, was the AIDS epidemic. Because what did the AIDS epidemic do? It made it obvious that certain people who people loved who were in their family, all of a sudden, their sexual orientation became more apparent. We never knew Rock Hudson was gay until he got AIDS. That's not to suggest, by the way, that all people who have AIDS, we know that they're not, but the point was in the early days that it had that impact. Now, it's one thing to not like those gay people. It's another thing entirely to not like my son Bobby, or my cousin Johnny, or my sister-in-law Sally. When it becomes personal, it's very different. And then the last one is to establish ways to get feedback, to create relationships where people can come up to us and say, look, you may not have intended anything by this, but let me tell you how your behavior affected me. Now, for those of us who are in power, in leadership positions, it's critically important that we recognize that we have to set the tone for that. We have to be the ones who put ourselves out there and be open to feedback, because otherwise people project all of their authority figures from their lives. If you had a father who didn't like feedback from you, or very few fathers do, I find, speaking as somebody with 4 children, then you may be hesitant, even if the boss says, sure, tell me what you're thinking. Because what we tack on to the end of that sentence is even if it costs you your job, But creating a flow back and forth where we can give each other feedback actually creates a way for us to see ourselves in other people's eyes, and it could be incredibly valuable in this process. Now, I want to spend just the last minute or two talking about systems, because you're working in an organization, and we know that we can change systems. In 1970, 5% of the musicians in the major orchestras in the world were women. In 1980, it was only 12%, even after 15 years of the modern women's movement, the resurgence of it. The number is now over 40%. What happened? They put in a whole range of structures and systems that changed the way they did auditions. The first one was they began to advertise for auditions rather than simply to invite people to them. It used to be the conductor would say, get me the second chair violin from Philadelphia to come and audition. Now what they do is they actually advertise them in trade magazines so people can show up and audition. The second thing they did is they started to use panels rather than individuals. The conductor used to make the choice individually. Now what they do is they have panels of people so that you have different points of view, and the more diverse the panel, the better. So you can get different points of view, what did we think rather than what did I think? And the most important thing they did was that they changed the fundamental structure of the audition itself. They began to have people audition behind screens and walking out on rugs so that people could no longer see the musician. They could no longer hear the shoes of the musician. All they could hear was the music. This is, by the way, for those of you who are fans, this is where the voice came from on TV. And what they found was it fundamentally changed the way you do music. So when you're changing a system, it's not enough just to do individual work. We want to look at education, because education is important. And I'm not talking about a quick talk like this. I'm talking about actually spending some time understanding these dynamics and how we respond to these dynamics. The second is to create priming techniques, because even if you have the best training program in the world, if you don't do a performance review until 4 months from now, how much of it are you going to remember? So you might have a little tool that you use. We call them performance support tools. Before I do a performance review, I take 2 minutes and watch this little video clip, or I read this sheet of paper, I answer these questions, so that I'm reminded to pay attention to some of the dynamics that might show up in the performance review. Makes a huge difference. The third one is to change some of our systems and structures. So do we interview people in the same way? Maybe we want to shift that a little bit. Maybe we have panel interviews rather than individual interviews. Maybe we send the interview questions out to people a couple of days early, because that balances out English as a second language or introversion versus extroversion. Maybe we be sure that we interview people in all the same circumstances, because if you interview one person fresh when you're 9 o'clock in the morning in your office, the second person in the cafeteria at noon, and the third person over Skype, you're conducting 3 different interviews. So there are things that we can do structurally to change that. Actually, for those of you who buy the book, in the appendix, there are like 16 pages of ideas for those kinds of things. And then finally, we need to establish a system of accountability. We need to keep track of these things at every stage, because what we notice is by the time we usually, for most people and most organizations, we have one metric for diversity, which is how many are there. But if we really look at the system, we see, well, how many applied for jobs? How many were offered jobs? How many accepted jobs? Now, how many are successful after 6 months? We can begin to see when the breakdown in the system happens. So there are things we can do about this. Yes, it exists. It's an inevitability for human beings, but there are things that we can do about it. And I'd like to end with this picture. This is a picture of an aspen forest in Colorado, because at the essence, this is what I'm learning about who we are as human beings. We look at these forests. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen them if you travel to that part of the country, and they're majestic. Thousands of acres of these ramrod straight trees that go up 80 to 100 feet tall. Incredible. The interesting thing about the aspen trees? They're not individual trees at all. Aspen forests are the largest intact organisms in the world. They're connected by common root systems. The way they grow is that one tree puts out a runner, and another, and another, and another. The largest one in northern Utah has 80,000 trees. It's one plant. One plant. For me, it's a perfect metaphor for who we are as human beings. We act like we're each different, but in reality, when we understand our psychomechanisms, the way we think, we're actually more similar than we think we are. We each have different material, different life stories that we process differently, but we actually process, different content to process, but we actually process that information very much the same way. And if we can really get that, then instead of saying, why are you that way, we could say, why are you that way? So there's a difference between fear and curiosity. In that conversation, we can create environments in which everybody can thrive. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.